First off, congratulations. You made it to a 9 a.m. event despite the party last night. Now we're talking about regulations. The rapid expansion of cryptocurrencies, as well as the shocking collapse of FTC, has prompted regulators wanting greater scrutiny, oversight of the crypto space. We know it is still in its infancy. It is a young sector, and regulations will dictate how this particular sector grows. So the right policies are essential. How does it look like? Where do we stand right now? Perfect panel to give you insights on that. Anthony, let's start with you. Let's start with the US. The US tried to get a framework together. Efforts were bearing fruit until 2023 when efforts kind of stalled. But when you take a look at the SEC, it's been clamping down, it's been enforcing regulations on stakeholders, participants. How are you assessing what it is doing right now? To what extent is it an overreach?
Well, it's definitely an overreach, but I think it can be explained. And so what really happened is that Sam Bankman-Fried and his parents met many times with Gary Gensler. They met many times with Elizabeth Warren, and Professor Warren, when she was at Harvard Law School, was very close to Sam's parents. And so he was very close to getting margin approval inside the United States before the fraud was uncovered. And so when that exploded, Gensler and Warren made a decision to go very hard at the industry to eclipse the potential media fallout that they would have had as a result of being that close to FTX. And so what they've done is really hurt the Democrats, frankly, because the regulation through enforcement and the other actions that they've done at the SEC has hurt the industry, has also hurt lots of the younger political leaders in the Democratic Party. And so, and I'll just say this, whatever my feelings are about President Trump, I applaud him for understanding how important this industry is for the United States. And I think, ironically, he's pulling the Democrats along into a centrist position on regulation. But that's really what happened. That's how we got to where we are. And hopefully we're coming out of it now. This dark age of cryptocurrency regulation is hopefully ending.
So an overreach, but Jeremy, I mean, Gensler says, you know what, this sector is actually rife with fraud. It has to stop.
Yeah, I mean, look, there's no question that there's an incredible amount of fraud and abuse in this industry. Like, you just have to look around and see the things that happen. And so the concept that we should have a set of rules that provide investor protections, disclosures, market surveillance, market conduct, I don't think anyone disagrees with that. I think, and I don't think anyone disagrees with having rules that deal with fraud and criminal, and all kinds of stuff. So I think everyone agrees about that. I think what most of us in the industry have been saying for years, for in my case, for 5 years, 10 years, has been we have to actually do the hard work as policymakers to understand what digital assets are, to come up with the appropriate classification and definitions, do the work of statutory definitions of digital assets, general utility tokens, digital commodities, what are digital securities, do the work, and then determine the best supervisory structure for that. And I think that's what the Congress has been making progress on that. I mean, really material progress, and it blew up after the Sam Bankman-Fried episode. But that's back at the table, and I think is bipartisan, and I think everyone sort of agrees it's not straightforward. And regulation by enforcement has not been an effective strategy. It's been a very, very destructive strategy, in my view. But it's sort of like do the work. Other countries, the European Union, European Economic Area is 750 million people. The European Union did the work, 600 pages of legislative text, and then tens of thousands of pages of detailed supervisory frameworks. And the entire global industry is now coming into compliance with a reasonable regulatory framework. So Europe is outpacing the United States. They've done the work. So the United States needs to do the work, is really my view. And by the way, I think that work will get done irrespective of who wins the presidential election, because that is work that members in the Senate and the House, Democrats, Republicans, are jointly focused on getting done. There may be different flavors to what that end product looks like, but at the end of the day, I think that work gets done. It's a priority for Congress, and you know, we've seen you know, leadership on both sides say this is going to be, you know, top of the list in the new Congress for them to get done.
Mike, they say that Europe got it done because the market is way smaller than the US.
I'm sorry, I didn't hear that.
Some people say that Europe got it done in terms of regulation because the market is way smaller than the US. It is complicated in the US, they say. Do you agree?
I guess I would mostly agree with that. Actually, I agree with what Jeremy said. Like, you know, we got to do the work. Regulation is a little tiny word, but it covers a lot of distance across the various types of regulations we have. And I think even the legislators that are in place, they don't even know the full scope of how it existed or why it exists or when it was born. Remember, a lot of the frameworks that we have here in the United States go all the way back to 1933, 1940. You know, the US has led and put that in place, and then it's been iterated on, but it hasn't had anything that's as transformative as digital assets until all of a sudden. So, look, you got to break it down. There's, you mentioned fraud, which is straight up criminal activity. Hey, we have Bernie Madoff too, right? So those types of straight out, persistent, long-term liars, they will come from time to time, and they will hit any type of market, digital or otherwise. Then you've got law enforcement related items like AML, KYC, transaction monitoring, sanctions controls. We are very good at doing this in the digital space. We have technology that far outpaces what some of the guys that were building their technology systems, you know, 10, 20 years ago ever had. So we're starting with a point of that's the easy part. The do the work part that Jeremy mentions, when I think about it, is really about the market structure component. We have done zero in the United States to define market structure. And the difference here is small players like a single bad actor, you know, doing some terrible criminal activity versus the entire market going down. And that's what happened with FTX. When you don't have the market structure isolating the exchange away from the broker-dealer, away from the clearinghouse and custodians, and I'm not saying that that's the right market structure for crypto, but if you don't have that, that's where you get the $10 billion failures. So anyway, I think the do the work part is the heavy lifting, and unfortunately, a lot of legislators and regulators are having to go back and kind of relearn. Wait a minute, why is it the way it is? And then what's different about this industry, and how do we reapply it?
Richard, how do you look at it? Binance has been on the other side of regulation. And we also know that Binance has actually spent millions of dollars investing into a regulatory framework. How do you look at it, and how are you assessing how the SEC is reacting to you?
Well, so first of all, I'm the minority here. All these three gentlemen are Americans. I'm Singaporean, so it's great to be home. But thank you. So if I mean, I can't speak for the American lens, but if you, I mean, there are a few key trends to look at, right? So it's not only in the States that this conversation at the political level is taking root and taking traction, right? So it just shows around the world, be it in places like Latin America, Brazil, Argentina, El Salvador, different parts of Asia Pacific, in Europe. It just shows the growing influence of crypto space, and people recognize that this is going to be the space of the future, together with AI. It will form the infrastructure for many different industries building forward, right? So it is an important sector to foster. The issue is how to foster it, right? Different countries have different agenda, right? So America politics is slightly tougher in that sense because firstly, you have different regulatory agencies, and firstly, there's a turf issue. And unlike Singapore, you only have one central bank that regulates everything. I think that's one. So if you ask the securities regulator, what is this product, right? They'll say it's security. If you ask commodities, they say it's a commodity. Singapore Central Bank says it's a digital payment token. So therein lies a tough challenge. Unlike the banking space or security space, where most of the rules are already harmonized globally, in this space is totally different, right? Depending on where you are, some jurisdiction define it as a virtual asset in a different form. So for a global exchange like ourselves, and we are the most licensed exchange globally, we have secured 19 regulatory approval, the latest being in India and Indonesia. Earlier on this year, we announced Kazakhstan, Dubai, Thailand, etc. So the challenge is you have to firstly work with the policymakers and then regulatory agencies to understand their agenda. And then for us is trying to operationalize based on the local needs. And what we really hope is, hopefully over time, to see greater harmonization of those standards globally.
But therein lies the issue, harmonization, a global standard. But before we go to that, I just want to take a look still in the US, since we've been talking about the SEC. Let's bring in the US election. Of course, has been highly debating on what the policies might look like in terms of cryptocurrencies. Pro-Harris, is there any clarity on the kind of crypto policies she would adopt?
So if it's okay, I just want to emphasize what Richard is saying. And so we've politicized the regulatory process in the US. And so it's hard left or hard right regulatory ideas. It's not right or wrong for the industry. And if you go to Dubai or a place like Singapore, they're looking at it very clinically, and it's almost an independent standard of regulation straining out all the politics. And so I think it's best practices in places like Dubai or Abu Dhabi and Singapore, and I think the United States needs to think about adopting best practices that strains out the politics. But on the topic of crypto and Vice President Harris, there's a group of us that are working with her, including this week. Frankly, I'm here, but there's a group of cryptocurrency advocates, Bitcoin advocates, et cetera, that are working alongside of her to distance the Democratic Party, the future of the Democratic Party, away from Elizabeth Warren and Gary Gensler. And I believe that we are making progress, and I think it's going in the right direction. And I will make this prediction that in the next congressional session, there'll be positive legislation and great clarity on stablecoins, great clarity on what we're going to do in terms of a regulatory framework that's fair for the industry. But I just want to say this one quick last thing. The danger that we all have is one side takes it in the United States, and then because that side takes it, and let's just face it, Donald Trump is a polarizing person, he's for it, it could touch off an avalanche of people that are against it. And so that's something people that are working alongside of Vice President Harris, whether it's Mike Novogratz, myself, Mark Cuban, really want to prevent that from happening. We want crypto in the US to have a bipartisan standard strained from the political tribal conflicts.
So Anthony is pro-Harris, Mike is anti-Harris. In fact, you've been pretty public. You've said that if you're a crypto enthusiast, do not vote for Harris.
Well, look, I think I'm looking for a clear path forward. First off, business and politics don't generally mix. So usually in my career, I have never put business and politics together.
I wish somebody had told me that a long time ago. I missed that memo that business and politics don't mix.
We are in a strange situation where all of a sudden we've got a political tie to the business that certainly that I'm in, that everybody here on the stage is in. So it creates a unique circumstance. But if you look inside the United States, you've got the presidential power. The president is basically in charge of the appointees to all of the regulatory agencies. And so the president uniquely has a tremendous influence. And although we talk about Gary Gensler and the SEC, you got to remember it's the OCC behind the scenes, it's the FDIC behind the scenes, the FTC itself. All of these agencies have got heads of those regimes that are put in place that carry the views of the president. So we just have a tremendous amount of power up at the executive branch, and that's why this is so important. So we do have clarity, from the Trump proposals. They want to make sure we put in pro-crypto folks there. We have not heard the same from Harris. With Biden, I think it was pretty clear. If Biden were the candidate, it would be clear that he would keep the same people in play. With Harris, there's a little bit of mystery, like maybe she's going to switch it up, but she really hasn't come out and said much. And then lastly, look, we all like to think that crypto is the center of the political universe, and maybe it should be. It's certainly a huge part of the future. But the rest of the world ain't there yet, so there's a lot of other issues that are at stake. She's not necessarily going to pick up crypto as the main
Not to defend Harris or anything, but her nomination did come in quite late, so perhaps she still needs some time to figure out what she wants to do in terms of crypto policy. But in terms of Trump, Jeremy, I mean, he's been quite clear. He is for it. He launched a platform just recently, just weeks before the election, and of course, yesterday was all over how he bought his burger with a Bitcoin in Greenwich Village. Surely there must be a line to be drawn, conflict of interest. Not necessarily a good thing for the industry.
Look, I'll say a couple things just on the general topic. I think the first is, if you look at Circle's color palette, purple is our primary color. And so Circle is purple, and I really mean that. And I believe
this guy's getting regulatory.
And I believe that crypto is purple, meaning that this is technology. And this technology keeps being built, and the innovation around it is global. And it's engineers, and it's entrepreneurs, and it's all these people building this technology. Technology does not care about politics. Technology is technical progress. And I have been in this industry through multiple Democratic, Republican, other administrations, and the technology keeps improving. It doesn't matter who's in power. The technology keeps improving.
Does not care about politics, but policies do.
No, but here's my view. Here's my view. My view is that when technology delivers utility to society, to individuals, to firms, to households, to people around the world, policy is responsive to society. At the end of the day, when Uber became a better way to take transportation, it didn't matter that all of the regulators in all these countries said, we don't like this, because society said this is better. And so they adapted. And so I think what we're seeing right now is we're seeing breakthroughs in this technology, the asset class, the infrastructure, stablecoin utility. Like, we're seeing breakthroughs in the technology. We're on the cusp of significant mainstream acceptance of this all around the world. And policy is actually responding to that. They're saying, okay, I think everyone thought after FTX, and if we just sort of contain this thing and so on, it'll just go away. Because they weren't paying attention to the actual technology progress. This will go away. We'll just pound on this and hopefully it's gone. And that obviously doesn't work, because this technology keeps making progress. And so my view is, it doesn't matter. It doesn't matter who wins the presidential election, because everyone who's here, if you look around, is building technology, building more innovations, building more useful things, and policy will, in the end, be responsive to that technology development. It's happened in every other technology epoch, and it's going to happen here. So I don't actually think it matters. You might have it matter around the margin in different areas. You might have it might matter if there's a different appointee to a particular federal agency. You might get a bend in the curve in a certain way. But that isn't going to change the arc of the technology. And so, again, crypto is purple.
Richard?
Well said. Well, so I agree with Jeremy. So if you look at it, right, why is that the case? There are a few general trends to take note of. I got involved in crypto right about 2017. And it has been a sea change since then, right? So, until 2-3 years ago, not many regulators were talking about it. Institutions are not in this space. So 2024 marks a very big milestone on that front. I got involved because I believe that this is going to be the future of money, future of finance, but it needs clear regulation so that players know how to operate in, and users know what sort of safeguards, what sort of guardrails there are out there to protect their interests, right? So that's essential, and with that, institutions will come into play. Crypto is the only asset class that went the reverse direction. So asset classes normally go from institutions to corporates to high net worth and retail. This asset class has been embraced by retail for the longest time, and nobody else believed in it, right? But this year, when you have the largest money manager in the world, Larry Finn, saying that he went from a skeptic to a believer and supporter now, that marks a big landmark shift. So we can bigger around the sidelines of what's happening, why is it so slow? But if you look at compared to even 2-3 years ago, close to 1/3 of global regulators are now regulating this space, providing clarity, right? 2/3 are still thinking through, formulating. You have the top 100 financial institutions in the world 2 years ago probably didn't have a crypto blockchain agenda. Today is so different. I mean, I can just give you some data. Just at Binance, right? So we serve today 225 million users globally. Right? This year alone, we onboarded about 45 million new users. So the first 100 million users took us 5 years to onboard. Second 100, 2 years. The next 100 will be even faster. And if you look at the young adults, their first investments are into crypto. Higher percentage into crypto than stocks or bonds or other form of investments. So this is an asset class for the future. This conversation is going to be extremely important for policymakers because you can't fight that trend. The momentum is coming, right? So you can't reverse it.
You can't reverse it. Momentum is coming. Millions and millions of people invested in it. Therein lies the issue. That is why regulation needs to be accelerated. Why are we still here talking about regulation having to play catch up? What are the issues that still remain?
We got 500-year-old people running the American government is the answer. I mean, we have to really just step back and think about it.
So we have the wrong people deciding on policy.
And look at the way the voting goes. If you look at the SOB 121, or you look at any of the votes, the people that are above the age of 70 always vote against it. And the people that are below the age of 50, particularly on the Democratic side, they vote for it. And so, this is a demographic moment in our democracy where the younger people are looking at the older people and saying, hey, you got to move out of the way and make this work for people. But what has me concerned, and I've said this repeatedly, we've had maybe 3 meetings with White House personnel, members of Treasury, sitting members of the Congress, both the Senate and the House of Representatives, is that you've got good actors. There's a protocol and a system in place at Binance that I would argue is best in class in the industry. Jeremy is best in class in the industry. Mike is best in class in the industry. If you've got people, and I would add Coinbase and people like Kraken as well, if you've got people that are best in class in the industry and want to do no harm to the consumer, why are you antagonistic with them? If you go back to the origins of the SEC, Franklin Roosevelt said, okay, we're going to go to the industry. We used to call these people banksters in the 1920s. Okay, they were ripping people off. The markets crashed. Roosevelt got the job, and he went to the industry and said, help us identify the bad actors. Tell us what people are doing in this industry that is terrible. And so we're going to regulate out of that and protect people. And it worked incredibly well. We don't do that anymore in the United States. And we have to go back to the origins of the SEC. There's a great book on this. Diana Henriquez wrote a book called Taming the Street that talks about the origins of the SEC. My thing, and I've said this in several White House meetings now, go back to the origins of the SEC and let's build this thing so that it takes care of the industry, takes care of the customers, and rewards the people on this dais here that are best practicing people.
Jeremy brought up the point that Europe got its act together, right? It's the first to come up with its comprehensive framework. If there is a model to be adopted, why not adopt it? Or how should we be looking at this?
Bless you.
Excuse me. I mean, lots of governments have adopted frameworks on this. Thailand, Japan, there's some here in Singapore. The EU is probably the biggest market that has adopted this, and I would say in terms of the kind of coverage of topics, the MiCA is probably the broadest. But lots of governments have pursued this, and a lot of governments, in fact, virtually all of them, have clearly done the work of saying, we're going to define digital assets, and we're going to define some classifications here, and so I think there is a lot to follow there. So I think one scenario, as you're saying, is like copy paste. Here's something, et cetera. That's not typically how the largest governments in the world think. They're not interested in copy pasta, right? They want to they've got their own embedded complexities and they want to have their own view. And the United States, for example, right, we don't have an MAS, right? We have the CFTC, the SEC, the FDIC, the OCC, the Federal Reserve, and then we've got state regulators, and on, right? So you have a alphabet soup, and everybody wants to have a say, and so it's harder in some ways in the United States because there is so much large regulatory infrastructure already that has evolved because of history and in different ways. And so there's political infighting between the regulators over control and who gets it and who gets the budget, and there's land grab, all this stuff. So that's just like the agency politics, let alone the politics. And so it's hard in an environment like that to just copy paste. Yeah, I mean, I think the work that I'm seeing, and I think if others here, like the Digital Commodities Act that is sort of coming out of the Senate, which is a complement to the FIT 21 bill in the House, like they're going in the right direction, and I think they're taking a fairly reasonable and purpose-built approach to crypto assets and crypto markets. And the Payment Stablecoin Act, which is probably at the 98th yard line, whatever, the 2-yard line, I think there's sort of basically agreement from everybody that that is a sound piece of law, and like it sort of fits within the state and federal kind of banking supervision framework. So I feel like the U.S. has got a path, and they're pushing on it, and it isn't as much about just taking something that another regime has adopted.
Mike, I'm sure you've had conversations with regulators. I mean, how optimistic are you about a framework in the U.S.?
Yeah, look, we've got, BitGo has 7 trust companies around the globe. I think it's probably more than anybody does. So we talked to a lot of regulators. Actually unifying kind of some of these statements. Jeremy's right. Like, crypto's going to win over some arc of time. It doesn't really matter what happens in this election. Crypto and technology will persevere. But it is a matter of what happens over the next 4 years or 8 years. And we get quickly to the next set of conversations, or do we kind of have to churn in some of the political stuff? Can we get out of the divisiveness regardless of who wins, where instead of being like, oh, one side wins and then overturns the previous side, once we get past that shenanigans, then we can actually get to the next level. So Jeremy mentioned stablecoins, right? Super easy one, actually, for regulators to get their hands around a lot easier. We can start to take that piece out, tease it apart. Now the rest of the problem is a little bit simpler, and we can move on to the next things. I mean, even if you want to take stablecoins, look at how each jurisdiction is thinking about, well, where do you want to put the backing of the stablecoin? They're like, okay, well, Europe wants to have it in Europe, and the US is going to have it in the US. Some of these are pretty reasonable things to ask for, but they got to get defined. And federal regulators across the globe are all figuring out kind of what it means for them. So I think the reason we want to see a quick resolution on the US for getting the politics out of crypto is so that we can get on to the next set of conversations faster. If it doesn't happen in November, it'll happen either 4 years down the line or 8 years down the line. We'll see.
Is it even fair to say it doesn't matter, Richard? I mean, we're talking about regulations protecting investors. We saw how the collapse of FTC sent the markets reeling and people in disarray and getting burnt. Is it fair to say it doesn't matter?
No, certainly it does matter. So when FTX collapsed, I think that is a big wake-up call, because for the longest time, the industry has been requesting, has been promulgating, let's have clear regulations, right, so that we know how to operate in. Let's have clear regulations so users know what our protection is out there, right, for their purpose. And it does matter because it's very important, not only from things like how do you fight financial crimes, anti-money laundering, but the user protection part of that is very important. But I believe that regulation itself cannot be the be-all and end-all, right? So you have smart regulations and you have not so smart regulations, right? So if you have regulations that come out just looking at one dimension, just managing the risk aspect of it, and forgetting the innovative aspect of it. How do you support this sector where the best and brightest talent are working on, that will be the future industry of the world, then you're forgetting a very important part of that dimension. So I'd rather to have regulations that get it right from the start, instead of having regulations that really just focus on the risk, and that inhibits the growth of that sector even further, right? So my own personal preference is get it right. Come out with smart regulations. And smart regulations will be hugely beneficial for most countries around the world, right? So if you look at how do you develop Web3 ecosystem, how do you develop AI ecosystem, etc., this will become the foundation for a lot of foreign direct investments, for creating new talent pool coming into the future, for economic growth of countries. So smart regulations is actually essential. Instead, just trying to roll out regulations, right, which may or may not make sense.
We've been talking about regulation in the US. Let's talk about Asia. Regulations vary significantly.
Globally,
and it's
not only in Asia, globally. Yeah.
Let's say Asia, because we've been talking about the US, we've been talking about Europe. I mean, how do you navigate that, and what would you like to see?
Well, again, going back to my previous point, right? So it's tough. You have to understand local landscape. So we do a lot of local deployment, and I always say that for us to do successful local deployment, you need to engage 3 different group of stakeholders closely, right? Policymakers, regulators for one, your users in that jurisdiction, understanding their needs is the other, and then third, working with partners, fellow partners. This is very early stage of development. We are 5 to 6% crypto adoption today, and that pace will go up quite rapidly. So it's tough. For example, Indonesia now regulates it as a commodity. Singapore regulates it as a digital payment token. Japan has a slightly different definition around that, right? So we operate across the globe. And it is tough because every time you go local, then you have to tweak the setup of the local jurisdiction, be it in terms of how you do operations, how is it set up, the rules and regulations are different, the type of token listings that you are permitted, the type of product features that you're allowed to route are totally different, right, locally. So there's a lot of adaptation to local needs, right? And that makes global deployment tougher. But at this point in time, it's something that we all have to live with, which is why I said that if we can work towards a common set of standards globally, that users around the world can say, hey, this is the minimum protection I'm looking forward to by participating in this space. It will be so much better for everyone on that front. And it gives certainty for all of us to operate.
Question is, how do we get there? That minimum protection. Let's go down the road.
Well, I'm going to stick with what I said previously, and I think Richard's actually done a good job of this in the UAE. He tells the regulators what the industry needs to protect the consumer, and I think we've got to do more of that around the world. We've got to have regulators committed to working with the best practitioners to get the framework right, and that historically has worked the best. And I'll just, again, remind people, when the SEC came into power, the 1933 Act for the SEC, there was a lot of loss of trust in the American securities markets in the late 1920s. By the end of the Second World War, after we got through the war, the capital markets became the deepest, widest, most liquid capital markets in the world. And one of the reasons why was the disclosures, the prospectuses, and the things that we came up with in the early 1930s. And so I think we've got to go back to that now. This industry is going to change the way we transact with each other. It's going to reduce costs. It's going to end third-party verification, by and large, as a result of the technology. And we've got to get people ready for that. And we've got to get people out of the horse and buggy side of this business.
Mike, how do we get there?
Well, look, I think certainly there's a lot of education being done already. We talked to a lot of regulators. They're very open to all of the information that we have to share about, like, what are we doing and how does it work. I think the one thing we need, and if the U.S. were leading forward, it helps a lot of the rest of the world. It just it gives some air cover for the rest of the world to kind of move forward more safely. They're always worried about what's going on in the United States. I'll disagree with Richard a little bit, which is like, on one hand, it'd be great to get the regulation all right, and take the time to do that. I mean, perfect. I'm just going to predict that it's not going to be right on the first time. And we're going to need to go through iterations. So if there's any one thing I could change, it would be to eliminate the regulation by enforcement and switch it back to, here's the framework we want you to use. And then if the framework turns out to not quite be right, we figure out how to tweak it and adjust it in a relatively fast manner. This can be done, right? Like the SEC, with some of the cases that they've brought, okay, there's the enforcement path, and whatever that brings. It doesn't bring a lot of clarity to everybody else when they do that. It has a resolution for one particular issue, but it doesn't solve it. If we switch that around and we say, all right, what would it take to bring that guy into compliance with what the SEC is looking for? So much more reusable. All right, so anyway, yeah, no more regulation by enforcement. We'll smooth it out.
So on that point, just as a former regulator, you raised an interesting point about regulation by enforcement. In most part of the world, policymakers, regulators are the ones that's holding the pen, writing new legislation. They have the power to come up with clear rules. And where the rules are unclear or ambiguous, they have the responsibility to make that clear so that people know what sort of rules to follow. And in many parts of the world, if the rules are unclear, it's construed against the pen writer, right? Construed against the people that come out with the rules. So, but US is quite interesting in that regard, yeah.
Yeah, I mean, look, I think about this at a kind of practical, technical level, because at the end of the day, the policy needs to just be aligned with the technology and the technology reality. So, we need definitions of different types of digital tokens. We need to clearly differentiate between things like an NFT versus something that is specifically performing an investment product that is an ongoing investment product. We need to acknowledge that general purpose digital commodities that power protocols and networks are general purpose digital commodities. We need to determine, like, if there's capital formation happening around a project, well, what are the rules that go along with disclosure and capital formation? But the reality is that the capital formation can evolve into a state where a digital token that had capital formation around it can actually operate as a generalized commodity. So that's like the actual specifying the reality that we live in. We need to acknowledge that digital tokens could simultaneously be used as rewards, as incentives, as compensation, but also used in governance, and define what those are. Don't just say this is the kind of square peg round hole problem. Don't try and fit it. Just define these things. That's really critical. I think that's what some of the legislation is trying to do. And if you do that and do that clearly, and you create a pathway where people can launch digital tokens with fair disclosure, where they can undertake and make use of the general utility of those tokens to drive economic incentive design, customer behavior design, and participation in technology in this novel new way, like it will bring an incredible number of entrepreneurs into this industry. So many people who want to start businesses in this space don't want to because they're afraid of the law and they're afraid of being sued by a federal agency. That's a terrible place to be. So we have to do the work to define things, and that needs to map to the reality of this, not try and take the reality of this and shove it into something that really was never designed to contemplate a technology like digital assets and blockchain.
Can I ask Richard a question, because I'm just curious about this. As a former regulator, and perhaps you could provide some context and rationale. What is the general reluctancy, I'm not just talking about the United States, but in general, for a regulator not to want to interact with the best practitioners? What's the mindset of the regulator? What are they fearful of?
Well, I think it's a couple of things. Going back to Mike's point about education, right? So I think first of all, many regulatory agencies are constrained by budget, by priorities, right? So in any given year, there's always budget and priorities. What do you focus most of your time and attention on, right? So it could be that they do not have enough resources on that front to devote expertise to understand this sector, or to recruit expertise to understand this sector. So that doesn't become a priority. And once you don't devote enough resources, you don't know this space and how best to formulate a framework to try to start regulating. And then the second thing is, really, is there any possible impact of this particular sector being so transformative in nature to traditional industries, for instance, right? So there are a fair bit of economic sort of considerations on that front, really because they don't understand this sector enough. So on our own, we actually do a lot of education effort around the world. So last year, we conducted close to 100 sessions globally with policymakers and law enforcement agencies to highlight to them the power of this technology, why it's so transformational, it's traceable, it is here to fight financial crimes, and all those beauty, and why you should support this innovation, and why this is so important. So a lot of things go through education. It must become an agenda at the political level. The agency must be given enough resources to devote enough attention and recruit talent to try to do this properly.
So it is a good segue to talk about stable coins at this point in time. So it's Jeremy and Mike, because USDS. There is a lot of appetite for greater scrutiny as well when it comes to stable coins, because it's growing phenomenally. 150 billion, if I'm not wrong, from 5 billion at some point in time. How are you looking at this appetite for greater scrutiny? Is it a matter of education, them not understanding?
I mean, it is in many ways the most straightforward piece of this ecosystem, because you're dealing with a payment system innovation, a core definition of electronic money, and clear rules around disclosure, reserves, anti-money laundering. Kind of from a payment system perspective, I think it's clear. I agree with Mike though that there isn't normalization of these rules around the world, and so I think unfortunately we'll get stablecoin laws around the world, and there's going to need to be iteration. So, for example, in Europe, we had to work very, very closely with up and down the whole regulatory apparatus of Europe to ensure that you could have a fungible USDC that worked under the issuing rules of MiCA. And we've come up with a framework for that, but that was a sort of, we're the guinea pig in this system. So I think many other governments need to kind of deal with the same set of issues, which is stablecoins that are internationally issued, that exist in different markets, but you're not going to have a standalone, distinct stablecoin for every market from a single company, right? So I think there's a lot of progress. It's 2025, basically stablecoins will be legal electronic money pretty much in every major market in the world, and then we got to continue to work on harmonization.
Are we getting out of this without election predictions? If we are, that's great. I think so.
Let's see, on the stablecoin, I think it's the easiest thing for regulators to get their heads around because it's most familiar with kind of existing products and services that are out there. Today, they haven't really picked legs that run through the banking system. We run a bunch of custodial banks, right, around the globe. Custody and holding of assets and backing stores, kind of consistent. As we go and talk with regulators about how that would work through us, it's kind of got a lot of similar metaphors. I do think we're going to see actually inconsistent law coming out from different countries, where it'll be actually technically impossible to adhere to both of them on iteration number one. But I think if we can work with the regulators, that'll get smoothed out and we'll figure it out.
If we get regulation right, we're seeing a bull market.
I think we're in the early stages of a bull market one way or another. I think that's the beauty of the technology, and that's the promise of what's going on. Irrespective of faulty regulation, I think we're going to be in a long-term bull market.
Mike?
Anytime you connect people together with faster, more efficient technology, you end up with more business being done, you end up with better outcomes for people. It's all around goodness, so yes.
Jeremy?
Incredibly optimistic. We're seeing the most technology progress that we've seen, the most legal progress that we've seen. the most market infrastructure progress that we've seen in 11 years since I've been in this industry. And so I believe the next couple of years are going to represent extraordinary growth for this industry.
I invested in this space. I'm a long-term bull. So, there are many more innovative projects coming out with greater utility, greater use cases. This sector will continue to grow, and we're just at the beginning.
Watch the space. Gentlemen, thank you so much for your time. Thank you.
Thank you.